Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi' al-huda. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters in Islam, to another discussion about al-Itibaa, emulation and imitation of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and destroying and eliminating bigotry, sectarianism, fanaticism, blind following of certain individuals, imams, madhabs, right, in exclusion of other madhabs, other scholars, other imams. So, throughout our lessons and discussions, we have been talking about the importance of al-ittiba' and how the Muslim believer, how he increases, the more he increases in knowledge of ittiba' and how to implement ittiba' in his life and what ittiba' is, and connecting the believer to the original sources of the deen, the Quran and the Sunnah, the revelation upon the understanding of the companions. This hopefully will remove the negative and bad and dispraiseworthy traits that some may have, such as bigotry towards certain individuals, towards certain scholars, bigotry and partisanship towards certain jurisprudence madhabs, or fanaticism towards certain scholars or individuals or madhabs. So, all of these discussions, we've been talking about the inner fighting between different schools of thought, between the Hanafis and the Malikis and the Hanbalis and the Shafi'is, and the strife and confusion and dissension and disunity that it caused within the Ummah throughout many centuries. So much so where we discussed how even in Mecca, even in the Haram in Mecca, there were 5 mihrabs. Each jurisprudence school had their own mihrab and their own imam, which they would pray behind respectively, and they wouldn't pray behind any other imams. So, and we also talked about the different books that were authored, okay, in refutation of opposing jurisprudence schools of thought, where many of those who may have been bigoted to a particular school of thought, right, would go overboard and exaggerate and dispraise and sometimes cursing and sometimes excommunicating other Muslims from Islam because they differed with them in issues of jurisprudence, okay, or differed with them in ascription to particular madhabs. Also, how some of the scholars or, right, muftis of the past or imams of the past even compared those who adhered or followed other schools of jurisprudence to Jews and Christians, being from Ahlul Dhimma. So all of this, brothers and sisters, stems from bigotry, partisanship, blind following of fallible, okay, people and their ideas, okay, and this all negates and goes against what true ittiba is. And true ittiba is the implementation of the testimony of faith. When we say ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, when we say I testify that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is Allah's final servant and messenger, what does this entail? This entails that we believe him in everything that he said, and we are obedient to him in everything that he commands us to do, and we avoid everything that he prohibits us from, and that we only worship Allah the way that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did. So today we want to dive a little bit into, just so it's clear to everybody, okay, the evil results and consequences of bigotry to madhabs and people, bigotry and partisanship, right, and the ta'assub and blind following and fanaticism, okay, towards individuals or madhabs, okay, just so it's clear. We don't want to have any doubt at all. We don't want there to be any doubt in anybody's mind about the dangers and harms of a ta'assub, okay, of bigotry, of partisanship, of fanaticism towards madhabs and people. So today we're going to talk about some of the ordeals or trials and tribulations and punishments, okay, experienced by some scholars of the past at the hands of those who were bigoted to certain madhabs or bigoted to certain scholars or fanatically following certain scholars or madhabs or blind followers of the madhabs, okay, and their sectarian and doctrinal fanaticism, okay. And it's very regrettable that we actually find these things in the books of history, of Islamic history. And the books of Islamic history are replete with accounts of such ordeals and manifestations of animosity towards those who called for adherence to the Quran and Sunnah according to the understanding of the Salaf, according to understanding of the righteous predecessors, and who sought to eliminate taqleed, who sought to eliminate blind following, and who sought to condemn fanaticism and bigotry towards certain madhabs, towards certain scholars, or towards certain imams in their views and opinions. And these accounts are very heart-wrenching and distressing when you come across them in the books of history. However, in compliance with Allah Azza wa Jal's command in the Quran, فَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ الذِّكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, and remind, for indeed the reminder benefits the believers. So the whole point of mentioning some of these incidents is to reflect and ponder and contemplate over them and draw lessons from them and take heed so that we in the 21st century, in the year 2025, after the hijrah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, okay, we don't repeat such actions. So we don't fall into blind following of one scholar or one madhab completely in everything that it says and everything that it teaches. And so that we don't fall into bigotry and fanaticism towards personalities, individuals, and certain madhabs. As one of the great poets of the past, he said, تعلمت الشر لا للشر لكن لتوقيه ومن لا يعرف الخير من الشر يقع فيه. He said, I learned evil. I learned about the harmful things. I learned about the things which are detrimental to me, not for the sake of them being evil or bad or harmful, but so I can be cautioned against falling into them, so I can be warned against falling into them, so I can guard myself against those things, right? As like, warning signs on the road when you're traveling. For the one who does not know evil from good or good from evil will fall into evil. So the one who cannot distinguish between good and bad is going to fall into the bad. So one of the first tribulations that we want to talk about, and we'll just mention them briefly, was what befell one of the great imams of the past of the Zahiri madhab from Spain, Al-Andalus, the Imam Abu Muhammad ibn Hazm Al-Andalusi, who died in the year 456 after the Hijrah. And his trials and tribulations started when he differed with one of the Maliki jurists in Spain, in Muslim Spain at that time, in Andalus. And, right, they showed intense animosity towards Ibn Hazm when he disagreed with one of the Maliki jurists. And all of them collectively, all of the Malikis and Andalus, declared him to be misguided, okay, launched severe criticisms of him and his books and his compilations, warned some of the governors and their leading figures in the government against him, and also forbade all of the common people, the common Muslims, from getting close to him or benefiting from him or attending his lectures. And they enlisted the support of the local rulers against him, caused him physical harm, and expressed hatred towards him, and eventually expelled him and drove him into exile from his homeland of Al-Andalus. And eventually this led to them burning his books, okay, and ripping them into pieces and scattering them in the streets of Sevilla. And other calamities also befell him at the hands of some of the bigoted adherents to the Maliki madhab of that time. And when this terrible trial and ordeal befell Ibn Hazm, some of his close associates were also persecuted and harassed. Among them was one of the great scholars, Abu Abdullah al-Humaydi al-Mayruqi, who died in the year 488, who was also known for his loyalty to Ibn Hazm and his teachings and his views, okay, and one of his close students. And when matters became too severe, right, and too difficult, he also had to seek exile, right, and seek refuge in some of the eastern Muslim countries. And due to this relentless pursuit, Ibn Hazm's works were rejected by scholars in the Maghrib al-Arabi, okay, northern Africa, and in Al-Andalus. Many of his books, many of his compilations were neglected, overlooked, and disdained, and they were banned from even being sold in many of the marketplaces and bookstores. So what were the main reasons behind this conflict between Ibn Hazm and some of the Maliki fuqaha? It seems that two main principles contributed to this. First, Ibn Hazm, he adhered to the Zahiri madhab, okay? And he was considered a independent jurist, a mujtahid, who did not imitate or blind follow any scholar, while his, I guess you can say, opponents, or the majority of the adherents to a particular madhab in his country, were Malikis, and they were strictly committed and adhering to their school of thought. Also, it has been mentioned by many historians and many of those who've authored biographies that Ibn Hazm, he was sometimes harsh, okay? He was known for his excessive, I guess you can say, self-assurance or self-confidence, and he had a sharp tongue. And also his belittling, I guess you can say, of other prominent scholars of his time who he disagreed with, okay? And these types of, behaviors should not be appropriate for any imam or any scholar or any student of knowledge or any mujtahid, okay? Even if you disagree with someone, still maintain manners, alfaz al-shar'i, right? Use the terminologies that we find in the Sharia. Try not to exceed the boundaries, right? And let your bigotry and fanaticism lead you to speaking about, especially students of knowledge or scholars, in ways that you will later on regret. Another example of one of the terrible trials and tribulations or ordeals that befell one of the great scholars of the past upon the hands of the bigots and the blind followers and fanatics of certain madhabs is what occurred to the muhaddith al-faqih, right? The great scholar of hadith and fiqh, Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi al-Hanbali, who died in the year 600 after the Hijrah, right? And he experienced not just one trial and tribulation, but multiple trials and tribulations. One such trial occurred when he was in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, and he was reciting a hadith. Okay, he was reading some hadith, related to Allah's beautiful names and attributes. And upon hearing these hadith, a group of Ash'aris, who at that time were somewhat the majority of the Muslims at that time, the Ash'aris, okay, so they overheard him reciting these hadith, okay, mentioning Allah's beautiful names and attributes upon the madhab of the Salaf, okay. Um, the Ash'aris, reacting in with their bigotry and partisanship and sectarian zeal, right, their ignorance and their bigotry and partisanship, right, led them to accuse Imam al-Maqdisi of tajsim, of anthropomorphism, and then eventually raised the qadiyya, okay, raised the issue to the governor of Damascus of that time, and then eventually it led to a trial and them having to come in a hearing in the court. And the Ash'aris, right, kind of aided and pushed the governor at that time to issue a fatwa declaring Imam al-Maqdisi an infidel, a kafir, deserving execution, and demanding his expulsion from Damascus. So that was one of the first ordeals that Imam al-Maqdisi experienced. Another ordeal and trial and tribulation befell him at the hands of those bigots to certain either ideological madhabs, okay, which left the main body of Muslims, or the um, jurisprudence madhabs, was what happened to him in Asfahan. When he arrived in Asfahan and he criticized one of the scholars of hadith, Abu Nu'aym al-Asfahani, okay, pointing out close to 300 errors in some of his books and writings and some of the defects in some of the hadith that he mentioned in his books. So at that time, the leader of the city, Abu Bakr al-Khunjandi al-Ash'ari, he was also Ash'ari, right, who died in the year 590 after the Hijrah, he became so outraged by Imam al-Maqdisi pointing out these mistakes and mishaps in Abu Nu'aym's books, okay? And he became, so angry and upset because this is, their great scholar of Asfahan, Abu Nu'aym al-Asfahani. How can anybody criticize him? How can anybody talk bad about him? How can anybody claim that he has made mistakes? Okay? He became so enraged in defense of Abu Nu'aym and actually sent out an order to kill Imam al-Maqdisi until he went into hiding. And eventually some of Imam al-Maqdisi's companions and contemporaries and students hid him in secrecy and sneaked him out of Asfahan into safety. And Imam al-Maqdisi's third trial and tribulation occurred in the city of Mosul in Iraq, when he arrived and he began studying the book of Ad-Du'afa by Imam al-Uqayli. Okay, Imam al-Uqayli, one of the scholars of hadith, he gathered a book, okay, in which he mentioned all of the biographies and all of the hadith of those who he considered to be weak narrators. Okay, so Imam al-Maqdisi, when he arrived in Mosul, he began to criticize and find mistakes and mishaps and faults in his book. Okay, and those fanatical bigots of the Hanafi madhab, okay, started to protest, right? Started to become furious because when Imam al-Maqdisi came and he started pointing out some of the things in the book Ad-Du'afa by Uqayli, right? Many of the Hanafi adherents and bigots to the Hanafi madhab became furious because their Imam, Abu Hanifa, was allegedly listed among the weak narrators in Uqayli's book. And this eventually led to the imprisonment of Imam al-Maqdisi, and they had written down that he's going to remain in prison, and there was an order for his execution as well. However, upon reviewing the book, they found that Abu Hanifa's name was not in the version that they had. And this was because They say that one of Imam al-Maqdisi's companions or students had concealed that section, right? And consequently, this led to the release of Imam al-Maqdisi. One of the third ordeals that trials and tribulations that occurred to one of the scholars of the past in the 6th century, a great Maliki scholar by the name of Muhammad ibn Zarqun. Muhammad ibn Zarqun, who died in the year 622 after the Hijrah. And this trial occurred when the Al-Muwahhid Sultan Yusuf ibn Yaqub saw his books and compilations and prohibited the reading of his books of jurisprudence, right? Particularly those of the Maliki school of thought, because this went against the school of thought that the governor and the government and the majority of the people were learning and teaching. Okay, but despite this decree, Ibn Zarqun, he defiantly continued teaching the Maliki fiqh, and when he was caught teaching, he was sentenced to be executed around the year 591, but was instead imprisoned, and his imprisonment was prolonged, and his books were burned and eventually not made available to the people to benefit from. Also, one of the great trials that beflicted one of the great imams was what beflicted and befell and afflicted Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, who died in the year 728 after the Hijrah. And he was imprisoned many times, not just one time. He was imprisoned many times for his promotion of the creed of the Salaf, promoting the creed of the companions and the righteous predecessors, and affirming Allah's divine names, beautiful names and attributes upon the understanding of the Salaf. Okay, and also Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah was imprisoned because he would issue verdicts and fatwa, legal opinions, in various issues of jurisprudence that went against, okay, the madhab that the government or the city or the town or the country that he was living in. Okay, and Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah was also known for his strong criticism of the deviant mystical doctrines of the pantheistic Sufis, okay, the Ittihadiyya. Also his rebuttals and refutations of the Asha'ira, okay, also of other jurists, okay, jurisprudence scholars who may have, had shortcomings or mistakes in their views and opinions in issues of jurisprudence, okay, until many of the Ash'aris complained to the governor, many of the Sufis complained to the government, and they ordered for Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah's imprisonment. So they reported him to the Sultan, and many of the Sufis, many of the Ash'aris issued fatwas declaring Ibn Taymiyyah to be a kafir, a disbeliever, to be misguided, to be upon a path, other than the path of truth. And as I said, he was imprisoned multiple times, and his final incarceration occurred in the year 726 after the Hijrah. He remained in prison for nearly 2 years, where they say at that time he was deprived of a pen, of a paper, of any of his books, and he was in prison for about 2 years, and used the remaining years of his life dedicated to worship of Allah Azza wa Jal, where he passed away in prison. Also, another great scholar who came about 4 centuries after Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah is Imam al-San'ani, Imam al-San'ani al-Yemeni, who died in the year 1182 after the Hijrah. He was also a free-thinking mujtahid, an independent thinking mujtahid, who was not bound to any particular school of jurisprudence. Okay, and Imam al-San'ani was well known for his criticism of blind following certain madhabs or certain scholars, and bigotry to the madhabs and fanaticism towards the madhabs. He openly criticized blind following and fanaticism of the madhabs. Okay, and he was known to incline to the teachings and methodology and expressed his love and extreme affection towards Ahlul Hadith, towards the people of Hadith and Ashab al Hadith and their methodology and their madhab. Okay, and dedicated himself, his life, his works to teaching the books of the Sunnah, explaining the books of the Sunnah. And some of his opponents, um, particularly the Shia, accused him of being a Nasibi. Okay, accused him of being a Nasibi, and their understanding of a Nasibi is somebody who shows hostility toward the Prophet Muhammad SAW and his family, right? And this is what they were claiming. And of course, this wasn't the truth. Despite the fact that Imam San'ani himself was Al-Alawi, okay, that he came from the lineage of the Prophet Muhammad SAW himself. So these Shia, most likely the Zaydiyah of that time, right? They incited the common Muslims against him, the masses to protest against him, claiming that he disrespected, right, Ahlul Bayt, he respected the relatives of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and neglected their madhab in jurisprudence and their madhab in ideology. And as a result, he faced numerous ordeals, trials, tribulations, adversities, right, at the hands of these sectarian Shia zealots. And Imam Shawkani, he mentioned this in a few of his books, but he didn't elaborate on the details. So these are just some examples, brothers and sisters, that hopefully um, clearly manifest that sectarian fanaticism, bigotry, blind following of certain madhabs and misguided ideologies was deeply entrenched within the ranks of the common Muslims, but it also penetrated the circles of the students of knowledge and some of the circles of the scholars throughout Islamic history. Okay, it led many of the Islamic groups that left off true Itibaa of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to excessive reverence and exaggeration concerning their imams, concerning their scholars, concerning their schools of thought, concerning their creeds, concerning their ideologies. And it also resulted in the deliberate transmission of falsehood, of making up false and fabricated stories. It led them to fabricating hadith and ascribing them to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. It led them to distorting history, okay, in favor of them and their madhab, and in disfavor of the opposing madhabs, and the persecution of several great scholars of the past, causing them harm, physical harm, emotional harm, mental harm, okay, causing them harm in defense of their own sects and in opposition to their adversaries. Thus, unfortunately, sectarian bigotry, blind following, and fanaticism became the foundational framework upon which many scholars, many students of knowledge, okay, and the intellectual and academic landscape was built. And unfortunately, many institutions, okay, many students, many scholars, and their entire scholarly heritage, okay, for many centuries throughout the history of Islam was built upon this framework. So, as Islamic countries and nations and states throughout time came to adopt various doctrinal and jurisprudential schools and displayed deep attachment to them, this influence became visibly apparent in the conduct of their officials and in many of their institutions. Moreover, this sectarian and partisan dominance enabled the prevailing schools of jurisprudence and schools of thought to promote and enforce their own doctrines, often at the expense of other legitimate jurisprudence viewpoints and opinions. And anyone who promoted itibaa and ijtihad and the abandonment of taqlid and bigotry and partisanship and blind following of one particular madhab or one particular person, and warned from madhab-based bigotry, partisanship, and fanaticism, was immediately punished, exiled, imprisoned, defamed, or boycotted. So hopefully it's become clear the harms and detrimental consequences of blind following, bigotry, fanaticism towards people and madhabs, and partisanship, and how it only leads to disunity, dissension, strife, and confusion within the hearts, the minds, and the ranks of the believers. So we ask Allah Azza wa Jal to make us from the true muttabi'een of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam and keep us safe from blind following, bigotry, partisanship, and fanaticism. جزاكم الله خيرا وبارك الله فيك سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.